Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal. Our adventures across the Peach State take us to the Golden Isles in this installment. We'll be taking you to Cumberland Island National Seashore. As we speak, we are on board the Cumberland Lady, and that's the ferry which takes day trippers and campers to and from the island. The cruise takes about 40 to 45 minutes to wind its way through the salt marshes of Camden County and then up the intercoastal waterway. Cumberland Island is the southernmost, largest barrier island of the 13 off the coast of the Peach State. It also happens to have the distinction of being the largest island in the world, which remains pristine and relatively undeveloped. It covers some 24,000 acres. Cumberland is home to hundreds of bird species. Wild horses,
now, one of the big reasons that people come to Cumberland Island is to see what you see right behind me, wild horses.
feral hogs, and deer. There are multiple species of reptiles, large and small, armadillos, possums, and raccoons. The landscape varies greatly across the island's acreage, which includes salt marshes, dense woodlands, and thousands of swaying, twisted live oaks that are often draped in Spanish moss. The island features around 16 miles of beach that stretches as far as the eye can see. More often than not, you'll see more shorebirds along the surf than people. Our trip takes us to this pristine, sublime retreat from the modern world. A part of the National Park System, Cumberland Island is a place for long, leisurely walks along its 50-plus miles of trails. The time spent walking the paths, road, and beach at Cumberland is a chance to leave your footprints on the same soil as Native Americans, Spanish and French explorers, plantation owners and slaves, war heroes, rock stars, business tycoons and their friends, and even presidents and sons of presidents. In fact, former President Jimmy Carter calls Cumberland Island one of his favorite places in the world. John F. Kennedy Jr. appreciated the remote island so much, he even selected it as the location for his wedding, as to avoid the paparazzi. All these footprints are but temporary, though, and few reminders of ours or theirs remain. The first inhabitants of the island were Native Americans, the tribe called the Timucua. They would basically trade and even war with other tribes in the region, and basically live off the land and resources available. Their lives changed little for centuries, that is until the 1500s, the age of exploration. French, Spanish, and British expeditions seeking shorter trade routes to the east, spoils, and new lands would find their way to the Americas. The Timucua and other tribes would in time vanish or die from diseases brought across the Atlantic by the Europeans during colonial expansion. Archaeological studies done on Cumberland have revealed traces of the native peoples and their time on the island. The first European settlers on Cumberland would be the Spanish. Franciscan monks traveled to the island to convert the natives to Christianity. Then a fort, then conflict over the ownership of territory followed with the British. Throughout the next 100 to 150 years, the island would be influenced by the Spanish, French, and British. And finally, when James Oglethorpe arrived with a band of settlers to found the colony of Georgia, Cumberland would remain under British influence. With two forts, William and St. Andrews, firmly established, the island would serve as a trading post and border guard for the southern end of the American colonies. The resources of the island would also draw interest. First, for the sassafras. then for the trees, crops like indigo and rice. Then came the era when cotton was king. Former Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene would buy property on the island and would attempt to exploit the timber resources there. That would not come to fruition, though, for him, as Greene would die from heat stroke. His widow Catherine would remain on and build a home called Dungeness. It is said that the live oaks on Cumberland Island were ideal for the wooden ships of the day, and that timbers from Cumberland were used to construct some of the early ships in the U.S. Navy, including the still floating USS Constitution. More agriculture would be exploited during the 19th century by others, like Robert Stafford. He used slave labor to work his fields. Stafford would maintain his plantation and interests until after the Civil War, even going as far as to father several mulatto children, one of his slaves. At the end of the Civil War, Stafford, though, would banish his former field hands and burn down all their cabins. All that stands today are the chimneys. Stafford would eventually die, and his body lies not far from his reconstructed home.
House burned in around 1900, 1901, and Mrs. Carnegie rebuilt this house that you see for one of the Carnegie children.
Some of the freed slaves would return to the island to build a small community on the north end that included the first African Baptist church, which was the site of the John F. Kennedy Jr. wedding. The free men would go on to find work in the next chapter of life on Cumberland Island. Following the antebellum period and Reconstruction, business tycoons, wealthy from their profits in the Industrial Revolution, would seek warmer climes to buy coastal properties along Georgia's coast. Some would build on St. Simons and Jekyll. Thomas Carnegie, the brother and partner of steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, would build his estate on Cumberland. A new Dungeness would spring up in 1884 on the site of the former Greene residence. The palatial estate would become the winter home for the Carnegie family and their wealthy friends. In time, Thomas and Lucy would build other sizable homes for their children as they grew into adulthood. The staff to work the estates, the fields, and other operations would grow to 300, a great expense for even the wealthy. By the early 1920s, though, Dungeness's splendor would grow silent. Most of its furnishings would be spread to other family residences on the island, including the Plum Orchard Mansion. The Plum Orchard was built just over 100 years ago. Then a mostly empty Dungeness would be consumed by fire in 1959.
We're approaching the ruins of the former Carnegie estate known as Dungeness. The original Dungeness was a house that was built by Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene for his family. He died here on Cumberland due to heat stroke after the Revolutionary War, where he tried his luck at a timber business. Well, his wife stayed on, remarried, and continued Dungeness. Some of the Greene family are still buried here at the little family cemetery. The Carnegies moved here in the 19th century, and in the late 1800s built this spectacular palatial estate called Dungeness on the same site of the Greene's family home. Now, that huge mansion burned in 1959. But in its day, it was the site of weddings, parties, a host of gatherings of the elite who would come to Cumberland for the weather in the winter months up north when it was quite inclement, for a chance to hunt. They even had a golf course here at one time. Now today, Dungeness is but a shell of its former self after that fire back in the late 1950s.
Its grounds no longer the site of parties and socials, but are home to feral horses, the island's best-known inhabitants of today. The Park Service does surveys of the equines and estimates the herd to be around 140. These horses are descended from the stock the Carnegies once owned, but then turned them loose some 75 years ago. Now, that's a basic summary of the human habitation of Cumberland Island. About 2,000 plus years of history crammed into the first segment of this week's edition of Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal. We'll be heading to break and then come back and look at some of the unique sights, sounds, and creatures of Cumberland Island National Seashore. I hope you'll stay tuned.
Hello again and welcome back to Todd Wilson's Georgia Journal, coming to you this week from Cumberland Island National Seashore. It's all a part of the National Park Service and it is a gem, the southernmost barrier island off the Georgia coast. Hope you're enjoying this week's edition. We've got a whole lot more to come. Right now, sun's getting ready to set, a nice little campfire to, well, keep the bugs away more than anything. Pleasant temperatures. This month of May, unseasonably warm and dry here, so we're not going to have a huge roaring campfire, but just enough to get the job done.
We've reviewed the human history and talked about some of the more famous residents of the island. But what about now? Since many areas of the island have become a national seashore back in 1971, all thanks to the Carnegie family, much of it still looks like it did when the Timucua lived here 2,000 years ago. The wide beach has